Well, welcome to episode 385 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this tremendous record from 1969, originally on Flying Dutchman Records. This is a 2020 reissue on Real Gone Records, which, given that the licensing appears to be legit, I have no reason to suspect comes from anything other than the original tapes. In any event, it's a warm, very listenable pressing. Horace Tapscott is a fascinating, influential, and admirable figure in jazz history. He emerges from Los Angeles, from the Central Avenue scene, or really more accurately from the wreckage of the Central Avenue scene. And if there is a theme to his career, it's one of refusing to compromise. This record was his only record in the first 17 years that he led jazz bands, and it's a landmark of avant-garde jazz, of spiritual jazz, and of socially conscious black music. Horace Tapscott was born in Houston, Texas in April 1934, where he lived for the first 9 years of his life in Houston's 3rd Ward. When he was 9, his family moved to LA. His stepdad worked in the shipyards there. He studied piano, he studied trombone, and he came of age in LA in a little musical scene, which really was ground zero for what became avant-garde jazz and free jazz. So he was a contemporary of people like Ornette Coleman, of Billy Higgins, of Don Cherry. When he graduates in 1952, he goes to LA City College for a while, but then he enlists in the Air Force, and for the next 4 years, he's posted to Wyoming. When he's discharged in 1957, he returns to LA to find that, in his view, the Central Avenue scene had basically been crushed by the LAPD. Central Avenue, of course, was the cradle of jazz on the West Coast. It was a major black cultural hub in California. And you can read different accounts about the decline of Central Avenue. One of them, which is, I guess, more benign, is that as LA gradually desegregated in the 50s and 60s, the need for a concentration of black cultural life diminished. And that's all very heartwarming. But I'd also refer you to Robert Monaco's PhD dissertation from the University of Colorado from 2022, which examines the role of police in 1950s LA society, and in particular, if you follow the link, which I posted below, the chapter on the LAPD's vice wars, homophobia, narcotics, and the fall of Central Avenue. The short version of that, which aligns very much with Tapscott's own view, was that the LAPD had hired all kinds of white cops from the Deep South. They didn't like jazz, they didn't like the drug scene, they sure as heck didn't like the interracial mingling that was happening on Central Avenue in the 1950s. And through a coordinated campaign of drug busts and usually lawless stop and search harassment, they basically brought a halt to Central Avenue as a thing. So by the late 1950s, jazz in LA was basically dominated by white musicians, either in Hollywood or down in Hermosa Beach. And the only reason I mention any of this is that it's basically the genesis story of Horace Tapscott's life's work. He had known the scene when it was great. He'd come back from his time in the military to find it basically destroyed, but he wasn't in much of a position to do anything about that right away. He had to cut his teeth as a jazz musician. He plays with Lores Alexandra for a while. He then gets a more lucrative gig touring with Lionel Hampton's orchestra. But while touring with Hampton, Tapscott had his heart set on returning to Los Angeles, in his view, to work on rebuilding the linkages between musicians and the community, which had basically been ruptured. So in the very early 60s, he leaves Hampton's orchestra. He puts the trombone aside and begins to focus on the piano, and he starts this steady move from effectively being a musician in the bop stream towards somebody who is more focused on avant-garde jazz and a fusion of music and community activism. And it's kind of interesting that he didn't pick the piano as his primary vehicle earlier on, because his piano work is very distinctive. It owes a lot, obviously, to Monk, but at the same time, there's really nobody quite like Horace Tapscott. And you can very much hear those influences, but also his uniqueness on this record. In 1961, he founds the Pan-African People's Orchestra as kind of a musical collective, and the Ark in the name is meant to suggest a life raft for black music and culture at a very difficult time. The orchestra was really ahead of its time as a movement. It lays the groundwork for that fusion of music and social consciousness, which really characterizes so much black music at the end of the 1960s and early 1970s. And as the orchestra evolves, it morphs into almost more of a community organization as well as a musical operation known as the Union of God's Musicians and Artists Ascension. They perform all kinds of functions within the South Central community. They're running food banks. Later on, they'd go on to host benefits for the Panthers, for Angela Davis, and so on. These are all things you need to do if you want to get a file started on you and get surveilled, which is what happened. And because of these and earlier experiences, Tapscott, perhaps understandably, was skeptical of how black musicians were treated and would be treated by the white-dominated recording industry. So his career largely becomes that of a revered and influential figure in the LA music scene, but one who remains relatively obscure outside that in the wider jazz world. And after he makes this record in 1969, he doesn't make another one for nearly a decade. He survives throughout the 1970s largely just by gigging in LA. He plays regularly at the Troubadour in Hollywood. And when he does get back into recording in the late 70s, it's courtesy of a fan of his, a guy with deeper pockets than a lot of jazz people, a guy called Tom Albach, who hears some tapes, realizes what a fantastic artist Tapscott is, and creates a label, Nimbus West, basically as a vehicle for Tapscott. Tapscott records fairly steadily for Nimbus West after 1978-79. He also revives the Pan-African People's Orchestra, and they put out a number of records, excellent records. Some of these are now starting to get reissued, and caveat emptor, there are some very cunningly designed gray market releases, so I encourage you to go to the Nimbus West website to see what you should and shouldn't invest in. As his recording career continued to expand and his fame continued to grow, by 1999, the time of his death, it would be unfair to say he was actually an obscure musician anymore. He was quite well known in the jazz world, but he, of course, had never been obscure in the community that he'd made his home in South Central LA, where he was and is still revered to this day. Returning the narrative to the 1960s, of course, this is when he's building that reputation. He's pursuing a number of different creative paths, and one of the things he does in 1968, a year before this comes out, is the record led by Sonny Criss, Sonny's Dream, Birth of the New Cool, on which Tapscott is the main driving creative force. It's a real unicorn of a record, a great record. I encourage you to listen to it if you haven't. At this time, too, Tapscott was now concentrating on working in a small group setting, featuring the talents in particular of a protege of his, the alto saxophonist Arthur Blythe, as well as a number of other veterans of the orchestra. And it's with this small group, this quintet, that he goes into the studio for Flying Dutchman in April 1969 to make this record. This record is made on the 1st of April 1969 for Flying Dutchman. I think it's made in LA, but I'm not certain about the studio. The producer, of course, is Bob Thiel, and the engineer is Eddie Brackett. Tapscott is on piano, Arthur Blythe is on alto, the drummer is Everett Brown Jr., and there are two bassists on this record. The first is Walter Savage Jr., and the second is David Bryant. Now, I'm not clever enough to be able to pick out when one of them is playing bowed or arco bass, and the other is playing pizzicato or plucked bass, and if you are possessed of that information, please do drop it in the comments, and I'd be very grateful. Now, Bob Thiel, who ran Flying Dutchman, is best known as Coltrane's producer throughout the 1960s. He fell afoul of the suits at ABC after Coltrane's death, and in 1968, he either jumps or is pushed out of Impulse. He starts Flying Dutchman, where he keeps doing the same kinds of things he was doing at Impulse. He records principally black artists doing spiritually or politically or socially conscious music, or often all three. And of course, in a couple of years, Flying Dutchman would really launch the career of Gil Scott-Heron. One final thing to note about the production of this record is that the liner notes are by Stanley Crouch, one of Tapscott's many different proteges who went on to have fantastic careers in their own right. Side one starts with the title track, The Giant is Awakened. This is a dramatic, unforgettable track. It's driven all the way through by this staccato motif on piano, which is actually something which binds all four tracks in this record together. If you're looking for a comparison for this, think Pharoah Sanders, but less pastoral, more martial in feeling. And it also compositionally has a lot in common with Pharoah Sanders records as well. You get fanfare at the beginning, then you get this righteous groove getting laid down, and then you get increasing passages of quite outplaying, particularly by Blythe on alto. The other track on side one, For Fats, is by Arthur Blythe. It's a very short track, just a little over 2 minutes. And again, another driving and insistent tune with Blythe's alto to the fore. Side two begins with another classic Horace Tapscott track, The Dark Tree. If Horace Tapscott liked anything, it was a great riff, and we get another one here, a similarly staccato feel to the music. The last track, Niger's Theme, is another winner, another memorable tune, another insistent tune, another tune driven all the way through by Tapscott. The interplay also between Tapscott and Blythe on here is remarkable, and it's probably the track that has Tapscott's most dynamic playing. If Horace Tapscott had never done anything else other than this record, the title track alone would probably secure his place in jazz history. But of course, he did lots of other things, and his stature continues to grow. This record is a wonderful place to start with Tapscott, and I would think if you like it, it will encourage you to start digging into his work after the late 1970s when he begins to record again, both by himself and with the orchestra. But this record is a gripping listen. It's a record I don't think any serious collection of jazz in the 60s should be without. And for me, it's 5 out of 5 stars.